The HOA built 58 houses on my land. Illegally, they bulldozed the dam that held the pond my late wife cherished. Then their lawyer president told me to my face I was powerless to stop them. She thought she could just crush an old man and steal his family's legacy. But what she didn't know is that her entire multi-million-dollar neighborhood was built on a time bomb, and I was the one with my finger on the button. So when the storm hit, I dropped the dam gates and let nature handle the rest. But the real secret that would destroy her for good? I found proof she knew about the flood risk the entire time. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe every homeowner has the right to fight back against a corrupt HOA, hit subscribe. You don't want to miss the moment their world gets washed away. My name is Jack Delaney. I'm 67 years old, and for 40 of those years, I worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I've built things on 6 continents, in places where one wrong measurement could mean the difference between a village having water or a valley being washed away. When I retired, I came back to the only place I ever called home, 48 acres of pine and hickory that my grandfather bought with his mustering out pay in 1946. It's quiet land, tucked behind a ridge that separates it from the growing suburbs. For years, the only sounds were the creak, the wind, and the hum of the small generator I used to power my workshop. On this land, I built a life. I also rebuilt a dam. It was an old logging dam from the turn of the century, made of stone and earth, slowly giving way to time. I spent a year shoring it up, using every trick the Corps ever taught me, until the creek behind it swelled into a beautiful 3-acre pond. It wasn't for looks. My wife Maggie was sick then. The chemo had eaten away at her strength, but in the water, she was weightless. The pond was her therapy, the one place her pain seemed to ease. After she was gone, the pond was what I had left of her. The first sign of trouble came in a glossy envelope with a fancy logo, The Glades at Willow Creek. It was a welcome packet from the new luxury housing development going in on the other side of the ridge. The letter was signed by a Karen O'Connell, president of their new homeowners association. She talked about community, shared values, and rising property values. Tucked inside was a map and a request. They wanted an easement across the low-lying corner of my property for stormwater overflow. They said it was a minor formality. I sent back a polite, one-sentence reply. No, thank you. The land wasn't for sharing. End of story. Or so I thought. A week later, I got a call from Karen O'Connell herself. Her voice was smooth, like polished river stone, but hard underneath. She explained that their engineers had insisted the easement was the only viable option. I told her their engineers were wrong. Mr. Delaney, she said, with a little laugh that wasn't friendly. Perhaps you don't understand. This is a multi-million-dollar development. A small drainage ditch is not going to stand in its way. I hung up. The next Monday, the sound of diesel engines woke me before dawn. I walked to the edge of my property line, the one marked by the iron posts my father had set 50 years ago. A fleet of yellow machines was tearing into the earth. Not on their side of the ridge, but on mine. A foreman in a clean hard hat walked over, holding a clipboard. He pointed to a freshly driven wooden stake, 20 feet inside my property line. New survey, he said, not making eye contact. Showed a clerical error on the original plat map. This is all HOA land now. We've got the permits. He showed me a sheaf of papers, stamped and signed. It was all official, and it was all a lie. I watched, helpless, as they graded a road right through my meadow. They laid sewer lines where wildflowers used to grow. Day after day they pushed deeper into my land. They were building a whole street, no, a whole neighborhood, where my family's property used to be. The noise of the nail guns and saws was a constant headache, a 24-hour reminder that I was being invaded. The day they came for the dam, something in me went cold. I stood on the bank and watched a bulldozer, big as a house, lower its blade. I told the operator he was on private property. He just shrugged and pointed back toward the foreman. who was talking on a cell phone, laughing. The first push of the blade broke the spillway I had formed by hand. Earth and rock tumbled into the water. With each shove, the pond bled out, shrinking back into a muddy creek bed. They called it runoff mitigation. I called it desecration. It took them less than an hour to destroy what took me a year to build, and a lifetime to mean something. That afternoon, I drove into town and hired the best lawyer I could find. He listened to my story, looked at my deed, and told me I had an airtight case. For 2 weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Then he called me. His voice was different, strained, nervous. Karen O'Connell was a real estate lawyer with a powerful firm. She had threatened to bury him in motions and file complaints against him with the state bar. He was backing out. "I'm sorry, Jack," he said. "They've got deeper pockets and sharper teeth. You can't win this fight." My last stop was the county clerk's office. I thought maybe a government official, someone sworn to uphold the law, would help. I showed the clerk my deed, the original survey maps, everything. She looked at her computer, her face blank. She told me the HOA's permits were all in order. They had filed for an uncontested easement, and since I hadn't legally challenged it in time, a window I was never notified of, it was now a matter of public record. "I'm sorry," she said, already turning away. "The development is just too far along to stop now. Legally, you don't have standing. Powerless." That's what they all told me I was. I drove home in a daze. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the half-built frames of 58 houses that weren't supposed to be there. I walked down to what was left of the pond. It was a ruin, a scar of mud and churned-up earth. The air smelled of diesel fuel and wet clay. And then I saw it. Sticking out of the muck, half crushed by a tire tread, was a small, faded blue ring. It was one of the inflatable floats Maggie used for her water exercises, the kind you slip over your wrist. I must have missed it when I cleaned out her old things. I bent down and pulled it from the mud. The plastic was torn, the air long gone. I stood there, holding that broken thing in my hand, and looked at the broken dam, then at the houses rising against the sky on my land. The whole world went quiet. The anger I felt wasn't hot. It was cold, heavy, and clear. They thought they had taken everything. They thought it was over. But they had forgotten who I was, and more importantly, they had no idea what they'd built their perfect little neighborhood on top of. In that moment, staring at the wreckage, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. That night, sleep was a stranger. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bulldozer blade biting into the dam. I saw Maggie's little blue float crushed in the mud. Rage is a fire that burns you out, but this was different. It was cold steel settling in my gut. They thought the fight was about land, about deeds and easements. They were wrong. It was about memory. And you don't get to bulldoze a man's memories and just walk away. My workshop is the only other building on the property. A simple pole barn with a concrete floor and a wood-burning stove. It's where I keep my tools, my drafting table, and my past. In a flat file cabinet in the back corner, under a stack of old core project manuals, was a heavy cardboard tube sealed with wax. My grandfather's papers. I slit the seal and unrolled a set of blueprints on my drafting table, weighing down the curled corners with steel rulers. These weren't county records. These were the original surveys, drawn in India ink on linen, dating back to when this was all just timberland. The developers, with their laser levels and GPS, had their own plans. But plans are only as good as the information you feed them. I spent the next 3 days in that workshop, fueled by black coffee, and a silence so deep it felt loud. I overlaid their publicly filed site plans, the ones I'd gotten from the county clerk, with my grandfather's surveys. It was tedious work, but for an engineer, it's like breathing. And that's when I saw it. Tucked into the roll was a smaller map, one I'd never paid much attention to. It was a U.S. Geological Survey floodway assessment from 1913. It showed the original path of the creek, before the logging company put in the first dam. The map designated the entire low-lying basin, the exact same area where they were now pouring foundations for their million-dollar homes, as a seasonal floodplain. An area prone to significant inundation, the old language called it. For 100 years, that little dam, the one my grandfather maintained and I rebuilt, was the only thing keeping that floodplain dry. Their engineers, in their rush to get permits, had built their stormwater retention ponds downhill from my creek. They hadn't just made a mistake, they had built a catastrophe waiting to happen. They designed a system to handle a summer shower, but they had placed it squarely in the path of a historic flood. And they had just destroyed the one thing holding that flood back. On the fourth day, a gleaming black SUV crunched up my gravel driveway. Karen O'Connell stepped out, dressed in a sharp business suit that looked ridiculous out here in the dirt. She didn't look at my house or my workshop. Her eyes were fixed on the construction site, a proud general surveying her conquest. She walked toward me with a clipboard in hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Delaney," she began, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "I wanted to come by personally. I know this transition has been difficult, but we have to look toward the future of the community." I just looked at her, saying nothing. "The HOA board has authorized me to make you a generous offer," she continued, pulling a document from her clipboard, "to compensate you for your trouble, and to acquire the remaining portion of your parcel for future community amenities. A dog park, perhaps." She slid the paper toward me. The number on it wouldn't have bought a decent used truck. It was an insult disguised as a favor. I didn't even touch it. Her smile tightened. "Well," she said, dropping the pretense, "you can take the offer, or we can proceed with the other route. I had a little look at the county records. You're quite behind on your property taxes. And this workshop, I don't see any permits for the wiring. A fire hazard, I'm sure. Then there's the matter of an elderly man, living alone, off-grid. It wouldn't take much to make a call to Adult Protective Services, a senior endangerment claim. They'd find this place unsafe." It was all there. The complete playbook of a bully who uses paper and procedures as weapons. She expected me to crumble, to take her pennies and disappear. I folded my arms and looked past her, at the framing of the houses sitting in the low basin. I thought about the families who would move into them, with no idea their basements were sitting in the path of a ghost river. I looked back at her. Her smugness was a wall. She couldn't see the truth because she wasn't looking for it. She was only looking for her next win. I let the silence stretch out, letting her threats hang in the air and evaporate. Finally I spoke, my voice low and even. "No thank you, ma'am," she scoffed. "You don't have a choice, old man. It's over." I gave a small shake of my head. "You built wrong," I said, my voice as calm as a still pond. "And I'm going to let nature decide." A flicker of confusion crossed her face before the mask of arrogance slammed back into place. She snatched up her offer sheet and stormed back to her SUV, spinning gravel as she peeled away. That night, I didn't go back to the blueprints. I took a shovel and a rake and walked up the creek, far above where the dam used to be. For hours, I worked under the moonlight, clearing out the fallen branches, the silt, the debris that had collected over the years. I wasn't rebuilding anything. I was just clearing the channel, making sure the water had a nice, clear path for when it decided to come. The broken dam could stay broken, for now. When I was done, I walked back to the house, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. It rang twice. "Benny," I said when he picked up. "It's Jack." There was a pause on the other end. "Everything all right, cousin?" "Everything's fine," I said, looking out the window at the dark shapes of the houses on my land. "I need a favor. You still got that drone rig?" Benny showed up 2 days later in a beat-up pickup truck that looked as old and stubborn as he was. My cousin is a retired hydrologist, but he never really retired. He just started working for himself, taking on the jobs that interested him, usually ones that involved sticking it to some big corporation or corrupt zoning board. He got out of the truck, a wiry man with a face full of laugh lines and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He didn't waste time with hellos. He just looked at the sea of cookie-cutter houses rising on my land and whistled low. "Well, Jack," he said, shaking his head, "you always did like a quiet neighborhood." In the back of his truck were two hard-sided cases. He opened one to reveal a drone that looked more military than civilian. A matte gray machine with a dozen sensors and lenses. He called it the Truth Teller. For the next 2 nights, we worked in the dark, sending the Truth Teller up into the sky. Benny flew it with a surgeon's precision, while I watched the feed on a ruggedized laptop in my workshop. He ran a LiDAR scan first, using lasers to create a perfect, 3-dimensional map of the ground, accurate down to the inch. Then he overlaid that map with my grandfather's original survey lines. The result made my blood run cold. The HOA hadn't just stolen a piece of my land. In their rush, their surveyors had screwed up badly. On the far side of the development, the property line they'd built to was off by another 20 feet. The backyards and patios of at least 6 of those new houses were sitting squarely on my deeded property. We had GPS-stamped, laser-verified, undeniable proof, but that wasn't all we found. The next day, I bought 6 motion-triggered game cameras, the kind hunters use. I mounted them discreetly on trees along the access road they'd cut through my land. The very first night, we hit pay dirt. The camera captured headlights around 2 a.m. A dump truck with the contractor's logo on the door backed up, its bed tilted, and a mountain of trash, broken drywall, empty paint cans, plastic sheeting tumbled onto my property, right near the wreckage of the pond. They weren't just building on my land. They were using it as their private landfill. Armed with a binder full of evidence, the LiDAR maps, the original surveys, and crystal-clear photos of the illegal dumping, I drove to the City Planning Commission meeting. I felt like I was walking back into a world I'd left behind, a world of rules and procedures that were supposed to work. I signed up for the public comment period, and when my name was called, I walked to the podium. I laid it out calmly and clearly. I didn't raise my voice. I just presented the facts. I showed them the survey overlay. I showed them the photographs. For a moment, there was a quiet murmur in the room. I saw a few of the board members lean forward, looking genuinely concerned. Then, a woman in a crisp suit stood up from the front row. It wasn't Karen O'Connell. It was one of her legal pit bulls. "With all due respect to Mr. Delaney," she said, her voice smooth and patronizing, "this is a resolved matter. The easement was legally filed and uncontested. What you're seeing is a coordinated campaign of harassment by a disgruntled individual against a development that represents significant community progress and tax revenue." She painted me as an unstable old man, a menace who was aggressively spying on hardworking contractors. She suggested my maps were outdated and my photos were taken out of context. The chairman of the board, a man with a soft face and no backbone, looked relieved. She had given him an easy way out. He thanked me for my time and said they would take it under advisement. Before I could protest, a uniformed security guard was politely but firmly touching my elbow, guiding me out of the room. The system hadn't just failed. It had actively pushed me out the door. I met Benny at a diner on the way home. He'd been watching the meeting's public broadcast on his phone. He stirred his coffee, his expression grim. "That's it, Jack. We sue them," he said. "We get a good lawyer this time. A real fighter. We can get an injunction." I looked out the window at the passing cars, at the normal world that seemed so far away now. I thought of my first lawyer, how quickly he'd folded. I thought of Karen's threats, of the county clerk's dead eyes. They had built their fortress out of paper, and they controlled all the gates. "Benny," I said quietly, turning back to him. "Lawyers need rules. They broke 'em already." He saw the look on my face and didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, understanding something had shifted for good. That night, after Benny had gone home, I was in the workshop, cleaning my tools, when I heard the ping of my email. I rarely get emails, so I went inside to check. The message was from an address that was just a jumble of letters and numbers. The subject line was 3 words. You were right. There was one attachment. A single file. My hand was shaking a little as I opened it. It was a forwarded email chain between Karen O'Connell and the lead engineer from the construction firm, dated 6 months ago, before they'd even broken ground. The engineer was flagging a concern. He had found the same 1913 floodway map I had. He warned her that building in the basin, without reinforcing the upstream dam, was a significant and unacceptable flood risk. Karen's reply was at the bottom of the chain. It was short, cold, and stripped away any doubt about the kind of person she was. The dam is on the old man's property. He won't sell, but he's a recluse with no family. We proceed as planned. Worst case, we deal with some water. Best case, he sells cheap after we start construction, or simply dies before it becomes an issue. My breath caught in my chest. I read it again and again. Or simply dies before it becomes an issue. It wasn't just negligence. It wasn't just a clerical error. It was a calculated risk, a deliberate, cold-blooded gamble. And I was the acceptable loss. They knew. They knew all along. The email changed everything. It was no longer a fight over property lines. It was something darker. They hadn't just trespassed on my land. They had willingly gambled with the safety of future homeowners and written me off as collateral damage. The cold steel in my gut began to heat up. A few days after my visit to the Planning Commission, new signs appeared, hammered into the ground right along my driveway. They were official looking, with the HOA logo and bold red letters. Private property, cease and desist all surveillance. Violators will be prosecuted. It was a pathetic attempt to intimidate me, to turn their trespassing into my crime. I almost laughed. They were posting no trespassing signs on my own land. But the joke turned sour the next morning. A shiny pickup truck, the kind driven by men who never haul anything heavier than groceries, pulled up. A man in khaki cargo pants and a polo shirt with a neighborhood safety compliance officer patch got out. Dennis Pike. I'd seen him around, Karen's little clipboard bully. He walked the perimeter of my workshop making notes. He was followed by 2 official vehicles, a county sheriff's deputy and a fire marshal. Someone had filed a code complaint. An anonymous tip, they said, about an unsafe structure with illegal wiring and hoarding of combustible materials. For 2 hours, they went through my workshop. The fire marshal was a decent guy, professional and thorough. He found nothing. My wiring was better than code, and my workshop was cleaner than his own office, he joked. The deputy was polite but distant, clearly annoyed at being dragged into a petty HOA squabble. They left without issuing so much as a warning, but the visit left a mark. They had brought the law to my door. They were trying to paint me as the villain, the crazy old man on the hill who was a danger to their perfect new community. It was a classic move. If you can't win on the facts, you attack the person. And for a moment, it worked. That afternoon, I felt a kind of tired I hadn't known before, a weariness that went bone deep. The constant fight, the sleepless nights, the feeling of being surrounded, it was all catching up to me. The weight of that leaked email felt heavier than ever. They hadn't just wanted my land, they had wanted me gone. I drove out to the small country cemetery where Maggie was buried. I stood before her headstone, the grass neatly trimmed, a small pot of flowers I'd left last week still looking bright. I found myself talking to her, the words coming out in a quiet whisper. "I'm sorry, Mags," I said, my voice cracking. "I let them wreck your place. I let them walk all over us." I told her about the lawyers, the commission, the cops showing up at my door. I told her I didn't know if I had the fight left in me. Maybe Karen was right. Maybe I should just take what little they'd offer and leave. Let them have it. Let them pave over the whole damn thing. What was I even fighting for anymore? Just dirt and memories. The thought of selling was like poison, but for the first time, it felt like a real option. A way out. A way to make it all stop. I sat on the grass by her stone until the sun went down, feeling hollowed out. I didn't turn on any lights when I got back to the house. I just sat in the dark, watching the headlights of the construction crews finishing their day. Then I saw a single light, a flashlight beam, bobbing its way up my driveway. I tensed, but then I recognized the slow, steady walk. It was my neighbor, Ed Marin. Ed lives on the other side of me, on a 5-acre plot he's owned for 40 years. He's a Vietnam vet, a retired plumber, a man of few words and unshakable calm. We'd always been good neighbors in the old-fashioned way. We waved when we passed, borrowed tools, and left each other alone. He walked up to my porch and stood there, not saying anything for a minute, just looking out at the half-built houses that now blocked our view of the sunset. "Saw the county cars here earlier," he said finally, his voice raspy. I just nodded. "Karen O'Connell," I said. It was all the explanation he needed. He grunted. "Figured. She tried to find me last year. Said the color of my mailbox wasn't on the pre-approved community palette. I told her my mailbox was here before her community was a twinkle in a developer's eye. Haven't heard from her since." He looked over at the mangled earth where my pond used to be, then back at me. His eyes were sharp, and they saw more than I was showing. He knew the kind of toll a fight like this could take. "Lost my boy to the VA," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the distance. "Paperwork, forms, committees. They talked him to death while they waited for a piece of paper to be signed. Bureaucracy. It's a disease." He finally turned to look me square in the eye. "Don't let him talk you to death, Jack." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy-duty valve handle, the kind used for industrial plumbing. He pressed it into my hand. "You fix that dam," he said, his voice a low growl. "You fix it good. Just make sure it ain't you who breaks it." He squeezed my shoulder, turned, and walked back into the darkness. Ed's words were like a lightning strike. He hadn't just offered support. He had given me permission. He had reminded me who I was. I wasn't some victim waiting for the system to save me. I was an engineer. I build things, and I fix what's broken. I spent the rest of the night at my drafting table, not with maps, but with schematics. The next morning, I was at the scrapyard, buying salvaged steel plates and hydraulic actuators. For the next week, I worked with a singular focus I hadn't felt in years. I didn't just rebuild the dam. I re-engineered it. I used the original stone foundation, but I reinforced it with a core of steel and concrete, and in the center, where the old spillway used to be, I built something new. It looked like a simple overflow gate from the outside, but inside, it was a covert, remote-triggered sluice gate system. I built a simple model on my workbench with a garden hose and some scrap wood to test the mechanics. No complex electronics, just simple principles: gravity, water pressure, and timing. One flip of a switch on a remote transmitter would retract the locking pins. The immense pressure of the water behind the gate would do the rest. As I worked, the creek, swollen by a few days of early spring rain, began to pool behind the new structure. Maggie's pond was slowly coming back to life. It wasn't the same. It was stronger now, harder, waiting. The new dam was finished on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The weathermen started using words like historic rainfall and once-in-a-decade storm. He talked about inches of rain per hour, flash flood warnings, and urban drainage systems being overwhelmed. I just sat on my porch, drinking my coffee, and watched the pond rise. The water crept up the stones of the new dam, slow and steady. It wasn't angry water. It was just patient, gathering its strength. I had spent my entire life working with water, understanding its power, respecting its will. Water doesn't care about property lines or zoning laws. It only cares about finding its level. And for 100 years, Its level had been right where they built their brand new cul-de-sac. I checked the seals on the new sluice gate, calibrated the remote trigger, and then I sat down in my workshop to wait. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't excited. I felt the same quiet calm I used to feel before a big operation in the Corps. The moment when all the planning is done and all that's left is to execute the mission. The rain started just after noon, a gentle tapping that quickly became a relentless downpour. The sound on the tin roof of my workshop was a deafening roar. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Benny. "Showtime," it said. A moment later, a live video feed popped up on my laptop. Benny was flying the truth teller from his truck, parked on a hill a mile away, well outside the storm's worst. The drone's thermal camera cut through the gray sheets of rain, giving me a bird's-eye view of the chaos unfolding in the glades at Willow Creek. Their brand-new, multi-million-dollar stormwater retention ponds were already full to overflowing, 2 brown lakes where manicured parks were supposed to be. Muddy water was already creeping over the curbs and onto the freshly laid sod of the model homes. I could see a crew of landscapers in yellow rain slickers trying and failing to clear a blocked culvert with shovels. The drone zoomed in on a small cluster of people gathered near a sales trailer. Even in the blurry, heat-based image, I recognized Karen O'Connell. She was jabbing her finger at the flooded street, shouting into a walkie-talkie like a general losing a battle. Her perfectly tailored suit was soaked, her hair plastered to her face. She was watching her investment, her masterpiece of deceit, slowly drown. I had my own set of numbers to watch. A pressure sensor I'd installed on the inside of the new gate was feeding data directly to my laptop. The numbers were climbing steadily. The creek, fed by dozens of smaller streams from the hills, had become a raging torrent. The 3-acre pond was now a 5-acre lake, deep and churning, pushing against my work. The pressure was nearing the red line I'd calculated, the point at which the old dam would have given way completely, not in a controlled release, but in a catastrophic failure. Benny's voice came through my phone's speaker, tinny over the storm. "Their ponds are shot, Jack. Basements on lot 4 and 5 are already taking on water. Your call, cousin." I looked at Karen on the screen, frantic and powerless against the forces she had ignored. I thought of her email, or simply dies before it becomes an issue. This was never about breaking something. It was about ceasing to hold back. It was about letting the truth, and the water, run its natural course. I reached for the small remote transmitter on my workbench and flipped the single guarded switch. There was no explosion, no violent boom, just a deep mechanical thump clunk that I felt through the concrete floor of the workshop. The locking pins on the sluice gate retracted. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of stressed steel, the immense weight of the water pushed the gate open. The sound that followed was not the roar of a flood, but the focused, powerful surge of a river being born. From the drone's perspective, it was terrifyingly beautiful. A controlled, powerful plume of water surged through the channel we'd cleared, shooting straight for the low basin. It wasn't a wave of destruction. It was a river reclaiming its bed. It hit the first of the illegal house slabs and split, flowing down the newly paved cul-de-sac as if it were designed to be there. It filled the foundations, swamped the half-finished frames, and turned the entire construction site into a muddy, swirling lake. The water never touched a single completed house that was legally on their own property. It was a surgical strike, guided by a century of gravity. The drone hovered, its camera capturing the scene of pure, unadulterated panic. The landscaping crew dropped their shovels and scrambled for higher ground. A couple of sales agents, who had been trying to show a model home to some very unlucky potential buyers, were stranded on the porch, watching their cars get swamped. And then there was Karen. She stood frozen for a moment, her face a mask of disbelief as the water rushed around her ankles. She turned to run, to salvage some piece of her crumbling authority. She took a step back, Her expensive heel sank deep into the slick clay, and she went down. Hard. The drone's high-resolution camera captured it perfectly. The president of the Glades at Willow Creek HOA, floundering in the muddy water, her suit ruined, her face contorted in a scream of pure rage. She was shouting that she'd sue, that she'd have my head, that I was a terrorist. But the only one who could hear her was the silent, all-seeing eye of the truth-teller hanging in the sky above. While the water was still settling, I sat down at my computer. I opened an email, attached the files, and hit send. The first email went to the City Planning Commission. The second went to the County Environmental Protection Agency. The third went to the main desk of every local news station in the state. I created a post on the local community Facebook group, the one Karen used to post her passive-aggressive reminders about lawn maintenance. In the post, I laid out everything. The LiDAR scans showing the 20-foot property line violation, the 1913 floodway map, the time-stamped photos of the illegal dumping, the drone footage of the flood, all of it. And at the very bottom, as the final undeniable proof, I attached a screenshot of the email chain, with Karen O'Connell's "or simply dies" comment highlighted in red. The caption I wrote was simple. Here's why the Glades at Willow Creek flooded today. They didn't have a water problem. They have a truth problem. 2 days later, after the rain had stopped and the water had receded, leaving behind a swamp of mud and ruined construction materials, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't a cop. It was a man in a cheap suit holding a leather folder. He handed me a thick stack of papers without a word. I didn't have to read it to know what it was. A court summons. The HOA was suing me for millions in damages, citing vandalism, willful destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. Karen O'Connell wasn't just pushing for charges. She was declaring all-out war. The story I posted online did exactly what I hoped it would. It spread like wildfire. The local news ran segments quoting my post, showing screenshots of the flood map next to images of Karen O'Connell floundering in the mud. Suddenly, the official HOA narrative that a crazy old man had vandalized their property started to fall apart. People in town started asking questions. More importantly, the few homeowners who had already bought properties in the Glades started asking questions. They had sunk their life savings into homes that were now part of a viral news story about flood risks and forged permits. The pressure mounted, and Karen was forced to call a public HOA board meeting to address the community's concerns. The summons I'd been served with was technically for a court date, weeks away. But the meeting was my real trial. It was my one chance to face her directly, not in a courtroom filled with lawyers and procedures, but in a room full of the people she had lied to. The meeting was held in the clubhouse of a neighboring development, a sterile room with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. When I walked in, I wasn't alone. Benny was right beside me, carrying his ruggedized laptop like a briefcase full of evidence. And behind us walked Ed Marin, my neighbor, his back ramrod straight, his expression like granite. He'd brought 2 other older homeowners from our road, a retired couple named the Gables, who had been fighting the HOA for months over a fence they claimed was 2 inches too high. We were a small, quiet army of the ignored. The room was packed. Every chair was filled with anxious-looking homeowners, their faces a mixture of anger and fear. The local news had sent a cameraman, who was setting up in the back. At the front of the room, Karen O'Connell sat at a long table with the rest of her board, including the purse-clutching treasurer, Lois Wren. Karen was back in her armor, a perfectly pressed power suit, flawless makeup, and a smile that was all teeth. She looked out at the crowd, her expression one of pained authority, as if she were a benevolent queen forced to deal with a peasant revolt. She began the meeting with a PowerPoint presentation. It was a masterpiece of corporate spin. She showed pictures of my quiet property and labeled them uncontrolled blight. She displayed the cease and desist sign they had posted and called it a formal attempt at de-escalation. She proof spun my appearance at the City Planning Commission as an act of public intimidation. Then came the grand finale. A grainy, zoomed-in photo taken from a distance showing me working on the new dam. She called me a saboteur, an eco-terrorist, a disgruntled vigilante who had taken the law into his own hands and endangered the entire community. Mr. Delaney's reckless actions, she said, her voice filled with manufactured emotion, caused millions of dollars in damages and put families at risk. But rest assured, we are pursuing full legal action. Justice will be served. She finished her speech to a smattering of weak, uncertain applause from her board members. The homeowners just sat there, silent, their faces unreadable. Karen looked triumphant. She had framed the narrative. She had seized control. She thought she had won. "Are there any questions?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge her. I stood up slowly. All eyes turned to me. "I don't have a question," I said, my voice calm and steady, carrying easily through the quiet room. "But I do have a presentation of my own." Karen's smile faltered. "This is not an open forum for baseless accusations, Mr. Delaney." "It's not an accusation," I replied, walking toward the front of the room. "It's evidence." I looked at the young man running the projector. "Would you mind if I plug this in?" I held up a simple USB drive. Before Karen could object, the young man, who looked tired of the whole affair, just shrugged and nodded. The homeowners murmured, leaning forward in their seats. I slid the drive into the laptop. The HOA logo on the screen vanished, replaced by the crisp, clear eye of the truth teller. The first image that appeared was the LiDAR scan, showing their houses built 20 feet onto my land. The property lines were drawn in stark red, a clear and undeniable violation. I clicked to the next slide, the 1913 flood map, with the historical floodplain highlighted. And then I showed them the overlay, with their street layout positioned perfectly inside it. A wave of whispers washed over the room. People were pointing, talking to their neighbors, the dots connecting in real time. Then came the videos. The time-stamped footage of the contractor's truck dumping construction debris on my land, night after night. Clear shots of their compliance officer, Dennis Pike, walking my property lines long before they had any legal claim. Finally, I put up the last slide. It was a screenshot of the email. Karen O'Connell's email. I didn't have to read it aloud. The words glowed on the screen, big enough for everyone in the room to see clearly. Or simply dies before it becomes an issue. The room went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, not fear, but pure, cold fury. Karen's face had gone pale, the color of chalk. The mask was gone. All that was left was the raw, ugly truth of her ambition. Lois Wren, the treasurer, looked like she was about to be physically ill. I turned to face the crowd of homeowners, my back to Karen and her crumbling board. "You didn't flood because I broke something," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that came from deep inside me. "You flooded because they built your homes in the wrong place. On my land, in a historic floodplain. They knew the risks, and they built anyway. All I did," I said, pausing to let the words sink in, "was stop holding back the water." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, in the third row, a man in a work shirt stood up. "I put my entire retirement into that house," he said, his voice shaking with rage, pointing a trembling finger at Karen. "You told me it was the safest community in the state." Then another person stood up, a woman near the back. "We have 2 young kids. You put us in a flood zone and didn't tell us?" Suddenly, it was like a dam had broken in the room itself. People were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. The news camera was rolling, capturing every second of it. Amid the chaos, Ed Marin's voice cut through the noise. "I make a motion," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "A motion of no confidence in the current HOA leadership. All in favor of dissolving this board and removing Karen O'Connell as president, say aye." A deafening roar of "I" filled the room. It was unanimous. Karen just sat there, stunned into silence, as the homeowners she had ruled with an iron fist voted her out of existence. Her power, built on a foundation of paper and lies, had just been washed away. As security escorted a sputtering Karen O'Connell and her disgraced board out of the room, the homeowners did something I never would have expected. They started to clap. It started with one person, then another. Then the whole room was standing, applauding. It wasn't for me. It was for themselves. They were taking back their community. They were taking back their power. The public humiliation at that meeting was just the beginning of Karen O'Connell's unraveling. The lawsuit she had filed against me was laughed out of court. The judge, having seen the news reports and the mountain of evidence I provided, dismissed her case with prejudice, which means she can never file it again. But the legal tables turned quickly. Fueled by the evidence I'd made public, the new homeowner-led HOA board didn't just dissolve Karen's leadership. They hired a bulldog of a lawyer and went on the offensive. They sued Karen, her development company, and the original engineering firm for fraud, negligence, and permit forgery. The state's Attorney General's office launched its own investigation into environmental violations from the illegal dumping, and the state bar began proceedings to review Karen's license to practice law. Her fortress of paper had become her prison. The last I heard, she was buried in so many lawsuits and countersuits that she had to sell her big house in the city just to pay her legal bills. The water had a way of setting things right. The county, facing its own embarrassment for approving the bogus permits, moved quickly to reverse the fraudulent easement claim. The 58 house foundations that had been poured on my land were declared a total loss. The developers were ordered by the court to not only halt all construction, but to remove every illegal slab, every foot of pavement, and every inch of sewer pipe they had installed on my property. More than that, they were ordered to pay for the complete ecological restoration of the land to its original state, under my direct supervision. It took them 6 months of hard, expensive work. I watched every day as the same brand of yellow machines that had torn my land apart were now being used to heal it. They carted away the broken concrete, filled in the ditches, and brought in truckloads of topsoil. They replanted the meadow with native grasses and wildflowers. And they carefully, stone by stone, rebuilt the banks of the pond, not the way I had done it, but the way it was 100 years ago, a gentle slope leading down to the water's edge. My story, thanks to that video, went further than I ever imagined. News outlets from all over the country picked it up. Engineering forums and land rights groups talked about it. Benny, ever the strategist, helped me license the drone footage. I never thought I'd see a dime from any of this, but the royalties started to add up. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to do something good with it. I worked with Benny and a young, honest lawyer to set up a small nonprofit fund. We call it the Land Rights Fund, a simple name for a simple mission: to provide free, legal and technical advice to regular people fighting HOA overreach or corrupt developers. We help them read the fine print, check the survey maps, and understand the rules that are being used against them. It's a small thing, but sometimes all people need is a little help to find their footing so they can fight their own battles. The pond is full again. The water is clear, and the birds are coming back. It looks almost the same as it did before, but it feels different. It's not just a place of memory anymore. It's a symbol of something else, a testament to the fact that some things can't be paved over, can't be bought, can't be bullied into disappearing. On a quiet afternoon last fall, I took a small brass plaque I'd had made and fixed it to the biggest stone near the water's edge. It has just 2 words on it: Maggie's Water. It felt right. Her quiet strength had been my anchor through the whole storm. The place where she found her peace was now a place where I had found mine. Life is quieter now, but it's a good quiet. The silence of the suburbs on the other side of the ridge is now just a distant hum, not a threat. The new HOA, run by the homeowners themselves, is a proper neighborhood association. They look out for each other. Sometimes, on a Saturday afternoon, a few of the kids from the development will walk over with their parents. I'll take them down to the dam and, using a small model I built, show them how the sluice gate works, how water pressure and gravity can be the most powerful forces on Earth. Ed usually comes over too, setting up his old charcoal grill and cooking hot dogs for everyone. Benny will be there, flying the truth teller, not to gather evidence, but just to take beautiful aerial photos of the restored land, the setting sun glinting off the surface of the pond. Looking at those pictures, at the kids laughing and the smoke from the grill curling up into the evening air, I think about what Karen and her company tried to do. They tried to pave it, sell it, and bury it under a mountain of rules and regulations. But they forgot one simple, unchangeable thing. It wasn't theirs, and it never will be.